I kick us off. So welcome, welcome. Thanks everyone. I know those of you that are over in Europe, it is getting late in the day for you. Thank you for taking time. I have a fellow Okie here, Misty. Hi, shout out to Women in Tech and Women in Tech from Oklahoma. If we've never met before, my name is Joy Apple. I'm a Microsoft MVP and the Director of Success for Orchestra Software. And I have with me today a fellow that is as enthusiastic about governance as I am. He just doesn't show it as much. Jay, how's it going, Jay?
It's good. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jay Leask. I am the modern work architect at the Microsoft Technology Center in Washington, D.C. I am new to Microsoft, not new to the community. I've been in the Microsoft space I did this math the other day, 5 plus 7 plus 5. So what's that, 17 years, which is crazy to me. And I'm very excited to be at Microsoft, getting to meet with customers and brag about how crazy and awesome our technology is. But that's not necessarily today's presentation, is it, Joy? So
I mean, big deal.
a little bit. So today, Joy and I are very excited to have a conversation with you. We are not demoing technology. We are not going to dive deep into governing SharePoint or governing Teams. The goal of today's conversation is to talk a little bit about what's behind Microsoft Teams. That's probably 5 to 10 minutes. Talk a lot about how Teams works within your information architecture, and then really dig into like what is governance and how do you use governance to support your information architecture of Microsoft Teams. Because I know Teams has been out a while now, but one of the conversations we have over and over again is, how do I manage, not just manage Teams, right? There's an admin console for that, but like, how do I actually encourage proper use of Teams and SharePoint when I can't just box somebody into a physical architecture, and say, here's your site collection, go. So the first area that we're going to talk about, and by the way, we welcome questions in the chat. Michael had requested, and we're very happy to honor Q&A at the end of the session as well. But if you throw things in the chat and we can squeeze an answer in as part of the slide we're on, we're very happy to do that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is really what is behind a team, because by understanding that anatomy, you can understand how to govern it. And that's a big part of it. So you can see here lots of logos, potentially older logos. I need to double check that we've actually updated that in a while. And there's two primary categories of content. The first category of content in a team is your chat, your discussions, your threads. And that information is stored in Exchange or Outlook. Now, it's important to say it's stored there from a governance and discoverability perspective, not an end user perspective. So you as a user cannot go into your Outlook and browse to the folder where all of these discussions are stored, as much as our power users would like to be able to do. However, if you need to do e-discovery on something, in the US, a FOIA request, if you're looking for anything like that, or even if you're a backup vendor and you're backing up this data, it's stored in in Outlook, in the mailboxes that are associated with either the group conversations, like if we're having a one-on-one or group conversation, or in using the word group is a bad idea, Joy, or in the group membership mailbox that's associated with the teams themselves. And so that's where that data gets stored. Now, also, that's where no, that's it. The next part is you.
But that's the magic behind the group, right? The group for
Mhm.
our group that works in Teams as a team, is it acts as a security service to a variety of components. And one of the things that I know I talk about a lot when I'm talking about Teams and governance is to remember that Teams is not a file management tool. It
Mhm.
is a collaboration tool that helps us get to files, helps us get to things. So documents and attachments are going to actually live inside of SharePoint,
Hmm.
and OneDrive, depending on where we are. Are we sharing within the context of a one-on-one chat or within a conversation as part of our team?
Hmm. Hmm.
So when we
And
start to think, ooh, go ahead,
nope, no,
Jay.
no, please
No.
continue.
So we start to think about governance. We can't just think about governance, governing one item, one area, or one tool. It does truly have to be a holistic approach to all the areas because things are in a variety of places.
Yeah. And the one thing that doesn't have an arrow here is the meeting recordings. So we've talked about the files. We talked about in addition to the files, the meeting recordings. So if you have a recording that isn't a one-to-one, it's stored in the OneDrive of the person who hit record. If you have a meeting that's in a channel, and we really do need to update this a little bit. If we have a meeting that's in a channel, it's stored in the SharePoint site associated with that team. And if you're having a meet now or a scheduled meeting, again, we go back to it's stored in the OneDrive of the person who hits record there.
And a good rule of thumb, if you're kind of new to this or you're trying to explain it to your user base, is when I talk about OneDrive, I talk about OneDrive for one person. So if it's a
Hmm.
one-on-one thing or it's not part of a larger audience inside of a team, OneDrive is going to be the keeper of that content.
Yep. There's one other thing we didn't address, Joy, and that is how complicated
Oh,
Teams has gotten. They're no longer just teams and channels, but there's shared channels and private channels. You want to talk a little bit about where that gets placed?
oh my goodness. So it can be a little intimidating at times, but again, when we're thinking about what we're doing and how we're doing it, security and permissions is always important. AI's coming, permissions need to be on point, right? When we're creating a team, again, I've got a lot of rules I'm discovering as I'm talking this morning. If you're in a team, that means you're on the team, you're a member of that team. All of the channels that are created as part of that team share permissions with each other, except if we're going to have a private or a shared channel. In those instances, we are saying, I'm going to pick on the private channels because I feel like they're the most used of the two and they're
Hmm.
maybe the most abused of the two. But when we're using a private channel, we're saying that there's sensitive information within this team that not everyone on the team should see, should have access to, or should be part of a conversation about. So we create a private channel and we lock it down. It's still members of the team, just not all the members of the team. It's a cubbyhole. Daniel Anderson, colleague of ours, friend down in Australia, thought that that term was hilarious. I haven't figured out why, but it's a cubbyhole. Just kind of squirreling away a couple of things there. When we do that, we tell teams, we tell the group, the security service, I need a private area in this team. Cool. Hey, SharePoint, we need a private area to store documents. SharePoint says, awesome. And it creates a whole other site or site collection for those of us that have been around for a while, old. We get a little frustrated at that sometimes because why do we need a whole other site? Why do we need this thing? Just remember, it is a security best practice to secure the largest object possible. Inside of SharePoint, that's a site collection, a top level site. So that's following the security best practices. But you need to remember that from a governance perspective and an accessibility perspective down the road.
Now, when you look at that, and we talk, actually, it's a really good lead into the next section here. When you look at the way teams are attached to groups, which are attached to SharePoint sites, when you look at the fact that private channels and shared channels create their own SharePoint sites, there becomes a conversation of, well, okay, how does that all fit into my architecture? And so the very first thing we're going to talk about is when you say information architecture, what are you talking about, right? There is the site structure, which I think is probably the most commonly referred to subject when we're talking about architecture, in especially related to SharePoint. It is how are those sites organized? The other two primary areas that information architecture often refers to and should be considered in the long term are navigation and taxonomy. So navigation, becomes a conversation of how do I browse from place to place? And we all know in Teams, browsing can be very difficult unless you're only a member of like 3 or 4 teams. And then taxonomy of how do I support search? How do I support compliance? How do I support sensitivity and security? How do I support knowledge management of all of the data that's in our environment? And so these 3 areas together really come together to talk about information architecture. Now, for today's purposes, we're going to focus on site structure. And you'll see how that fits into the other areas, but we're not going to get into global navs. We're not going to get into Viva connections today. But if you're looking to have conversations around navigation, as an example, look at your global nav capabilities, look at your home site capabilities, look at Viva connections and how you can bring both of those things into where users are and understand how they can support that. If you're looking to get into taxonomy, there's still managed metadata, there's labels, there's a number of areas you're going to want to go into. But for today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on site structure. And we're going to focus on how things used to be very briefly. And then we're going to jump into how things are now.
So let's talk about architecture. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Sites versus subsites used to be, I guess in some areas it still is, a hot topic. Back in the olden days of SharePoint, I mean, we're going back a while now, we would create a farm topology with various web applications. Those really aren't things for us anymore. And then we would create site collections, multiple site collections that lived across content databases inside of that farm. And it was absolutely appropriate to start off. And this is the way I would architect it. I would have a site collection for the home site, right? Everyone welcome here, right? That's where if you were an employee, you needed to get the stuff, you had links, you could go do your thing, download content, read news, blog stuff. Then you would create a site collection per primary functional area, like per department. Everyone welcome at that top level site because that's where all of the company public stuff lived. But then you would create a subsite, break permissions, create a subsite, break permissions, right? You would go lower and lower, and the permissions would tend to get smaller and tighter, like a funnel. We would nest things. That was the way we used to do it. But in the modern world, modern architecture, it's time to flatten that out. So we go to this more modern version. It actually becomes more of, as Jake called it out earlier today, we were talking through this, it's a logical architecture now,
Mhm.
not just functional, because the way we work is a little bit different. So from the SharePoint perspective, every
Yeah.
time you would think in the past, I need a new area with a new set of permissions, now you just create a new site. So human resources is going to have probably a SharePoint communication site where all employees have access to read, download content. But then the functional areas of human resources, they're each going to get a team and a team site where they do the work. Because there's probably a chance that people that work in human resources dealing with health, like health related claims and health
Mhm.
insurance and things like that, they probably shouldn't see the things that those on the wellness team are working on to go do other things. And they shouldn't see the same things that the team that goes and recruits new employees, right? So we need security boundaries between those areas. Site, site, teams. And it starts to work together really beautifully because by being flat, it feels like it goes super wide, and it does, but it used to go super deep, right? We haven't increased anything. We're just laying it all out where we can see it. The permissions stay really clean, and it gives us the opportunity in those areas to utilize the amazing features and other applications of Microsoft 365.
Yeah. And, Joy, we didn't really talk about it in our planning, but it leads to the idea of hub sites. And a lot of questions we get are, how can you possibly have such a flat structure? We understand potentially that Microsoft is pushing us in this direction, right? Governance falls at the top level site. search does not work when you go past 3 or 4 levels of information. And
Mhm.
so when you look at the idea of a hub site and you look at things like, okay, logically speaking, all of these things I circled in red are HR. But when we get to, oh, I'm on the wrong screen there. Hello, there we go. That wasn't, sorry. Well, I'll just pretend that one's not there. When we
What are you
get
doing?
to creating, for example, an intranet site, if we were to have all of these communications sites where we are publishing information out and we pull them all into a hub, now we have a home for our intranet. And we can set permissions at each of those top levels for people who should be managing and controlling them. But we use that hub to bring all of that information in.
I'm going to add to that real quick. Misty, spot on. She was right there. She was ready for it. Um, Keep in mind, not everything is going to need to lead to a hub. So, like those team sites that may get created inside of a department that are tied to teams. Probably not going to need a hub for all of those because the audiences are different. A
Hmm.
hub shines when it is connecting areas in your architecture that are related by audience, topic, but are wide in the architecture. You can bring
Hmm.
them together. I need a spot, like Jay said, all the different landing pages, all the various home sites in the organization come together and have like that primary hub site as the home site as the hub. I can do consistent searching there. I can push down consistent themes. It can create a really beautiful experience. Okay, but that's a topic to continue on another day before I get carried away.
So the question becomes, when we sprawl things out like that, I'm going to use that phrase because everybody talks about it as sprawl, right? Now we have nothing but top level sites. When I go into the admin panel, Joey, one of my favorite things to talk to you about was how excited you were to see all those SharePoint sites represented. But on the other hand, that level of visibility can be kind of scary. So how do we govern it? So the first thing before we talk about how we govern things, we want to talk about what governance is and
Mhm.
and the guiding light for governance, if you want governance to work, is you have to define what's in it for me, for people who are going to be affected by governance and have to think about governance. So the very first thought about what governance should be is governance should be a guide to help people use your system. Now, I don't mean a guide full of pages. I
Well done.
I mean that actual physical guide for people to say, okay, I want to put files somewhere. Let me show you where to put them. I want to secure my content, or I want to do information management. Let me help you automate that. If you give people a 500-page document that defines all the ways you're going to use governance in Teams and SharePoint. Don't get me wrong, it's important to document that information, but nobody's
Mhm.
going to read it, nobody's going to follow it. When you develop a governance plan, it should be geared towards how can we automate these rules. Um,
Mhm.
Not everything can be automated. I get that. So, but everything you do in governance should be geared towards, should have an eye on, I want all of our records placed in a records folder and I want it to get these tags. Okay, great. So we're gonna make it easy for people to find the records folder. And when they put content there, we're gonna automatically put those tags on it. I want teams to have a life cycle. Well, teams aren't going to have a life cycle if you make people do it by themselves. So let's have something, whether it's a third-party tool or something in Power or Automate or the Power Platform in general, that helps us to build that life cycle.
Would you would you agree that it's fair to say also if you can't enforce it, maybe you shouldn't write it down?
I would argue that if you can't enforce it and you don't have an eye towards that, then should it be a governance policy?
Agree.
Um, you have to ask yourself that question. I don't think it's as easy as saying you don't bother writing it down, but I wouldn't write stuff down that you don't see a roadmap to
Hmm.
enforcing.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, yeah, I agree there. Like 500 pages of do this, do this, do this, but there's no automation around it. Like, why are we doing it? Why do we want people to do it? Yeah.
Agreed. And an example I have for that, this is totally unscripted, by the way. I was working with an organization that wanted to say in a department's private team sites, they were not
Hmm.
allowed to change the web parts or the theme of their SharePoint site. Not enforceable and also not important. But that was a topic for another day. So I just thought I'd throw that out to kind of get you thinking about where do you start documenting your governance plan and where you go, is that really critical if the wellness team on their internal team, it looks a little different? Does it
Yeah.
matter?
Now, the last piece that I think that we want to talk about when it comes to governance plans that is governance is a living process. A governance document, a governance plan, a physical document, well, a Word document or whatever, it is a living document that has to be reviewed over and over again, not just because governance will change, but because the technology will change. When we were having this conversation a decade ago, we had 3-year rollouts for SharePoint. We had maybe monthly security patches. We had maybe every 6 months to a year major patches, and we could control all of that. But in SharePoint Online, you have no control over that. And so you have this technology, and it's not just SharePoint, it's Microsoft 365, it's lists, it's Loop, it's Planner, it's Teams, it's all of these things that are you're getting new capabilities all the time. Who got Copilot recently, right? Like it's starting to roll out faster and faster. And so when you look at governance, you have to look at it as an ongoing task, as an ongoing project that does not have an end date. And the way I recommend looking at it is identify first, what do we want to govern? Prioritize those scenarios. Step two, plan and execute that governance. We figured out we want to have life cycle. Let's talk about how we're going to do life cycle. Let's execute that life cycle management and then come around and measure how is that working. And that measurement might be simple statistics. It might be talking to the users who are affected by those governance requirements. So you measure the success and opportunity for growth of those governance requirements, and then you come back and I start identifying again. And so if you think Scrum like, Agile like,
Mhm.
that's how your governance should work.
And as you're coming up with these plans, especially on the Southern girls, want to say that the horse is already out of the barn, you need to make sure your user base is going to be prepared for those changes. None of us like it when something we've been allowed to do gets taken away.
Mhm.
For instance, everyone's had the ability to go create any SharePoint site they want at any time, go into Teams, create a team anytime they want. And part of the governance plan is to now funnel that through an automated process that runs off of a request form and a Power Automate flow. It's going to get an approval. We're going to have that life cycle thing's going to be part of it. But that means I can no longer just go create a team. I've got to go through this process. If we just roll that out and we don't tell anybody, it's going to be a major disruption to business. And it's also going to be a major disruption to morale in a lot of ways. And those are definitely things to keep in mind. So communicate,
Mhm.
advertise the plan, get feedback. IT, talk to the business, be forthright and come to IT with your feedback.
Yeah.
Make sure people know the change is coming. Let them know how they can prepare. Also, Jay's noticed on Jay's diagram here, they're all arrows. There's not a stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. Go back and review. Has something changed? Do we need to adapt? Are we going to improve it based on the feedback from the people affected by the plan? Go back and review it periodically.
Now, Joy, how
hmm
much how much governance do we need?
It depends, Jay. It depends. So, I mean, this is an old diagram, right? It's been around for a long, long time. But it's still relevant, right? Everything, what is it? Everything old is new again.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just create one rule and slap it on everything and walk away and think it's going to work well. Jay and I actually have some stories about that as we get to the end of the session. But notice we're talking about like the corporate portal. Back in the day, we had portals, right? Now we have home sites. That needs to look a little bit different than what the department level working areas are. That's probably going to look a little bit different on our teams, especially who's in our teams. Guests, are they internal only? Governance is going to be different there. Or is it just our personal stuff? I would love to see a show of hands. I'm going to switch to the people view in Teams. Who remembers my sites? Does anybody remember my sites? I remember them. Anybody? Anybody?
We got a
Okay,
few
no, Jay,
hands.
not only. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining with us on that. That needed to look different than the corporate homepage. So look at the areas where your people are working, the type of things that they're doing, and you'll see that from like the corporate portal to the functional business areas to the project areas, that governance gets different and it may even get less controlled. It might just be different. It might be less.
Now, when it comes to governance, I recommend 5 kind of pillars to what you're looking at. The first one is self-service enablement. If you develop a governance plan that requires every new team and site to go through IT becomes the bottleneck. I remember talking with a customer a few years back who had developed a process like this for security reasons. They had lots of sensitive information. They're GCC high, so government contractors. Um, and they developed a process like this. And what it turned out is it took between 1 and 3 months for a new SharePoint site to be approved because they developed a process that required so many approvals and chasing down so many people and became so manual that they just simply couldn't do it. So, very first piece of this is self-service enablement. And if in your organization that means, you know, if your organization has a rule that says users can't just create their own site, then you need to build a workflow that chases down the people that need to do approvals. And you need to build an escalation plan in there for when those people are on vacation or on leave or simply miss the email, right? So that self-service enablement is huge. It also establishes trust and develops a relationship with your users so they know that, you want them to be successful. Joy, your hand is up.
Yes, it is. Thank you for recognizing it, Jay. So, and along those lines too, maybe not every self-service creation has to go through an official approval. Maybe it should still go through a process. But does
Hmm.
that mean it has to have an official approval? So there's multiple roads to go down with self-service enablement and still have it governed and not just be the wild, wild west.
Yes, which leads to perfectly the next pillar here, which is balanced control. Not everything needs that same level of control. So what we did with that particular customer as an example is we worked with them to define a process for people to say, hey, I'm just doing general internal work versus customer work. I'm working on sensitive information. And depending on the answers they provided to these business questions, they could either get their team or site right away, or they had to go through this approval process. And depending again, if it was highly sensitive information, maybe they were an admin of their own team, an owner, or maybe we removed those capabilities and required them to go through a change management process to make any changes to their teams. So that balance of control, putting extreme control in places that need it based on sensitivity, based on use, going back to Joy's pyramid there, versus enabling openness and allowing exceptions to rules. That's the second pillar there. The third pillar, I think we've sufficiently talked about that enough. I almost said something else about horses that I don't think is appropriate, but that third pillar there is automating it. If you set up a process and it requires lots of manual intervention, you're creating a bottleneck, not a process. The fourth pillar, if we go back to the fact that a governance plan is living and developing governance is ongoing, having ongoing governance for your teams and your sites is very important also. Maybe maybe the use of a site changes over time. I created it for the office, but it's become a sales site. Well, that means we went from talking about happy hours to talking about customers. And when we do that, the level of sensitivity might change, the rules that have to go on it might change. So having periodic engagement with the owners of those sites, and I use owner loosely, right? But the periodic engagement with the people who know the use of that site, periodic confirmation that it's still being used the same way that it's always been used, that it's knowing what that inventory is, that becomes a huge part of being able to ensure your balanced controls are still accurate. And the last pillar, building off of that ongoing conversation, is managed disposition. Knowing how and when to remove old sites and old teams, knowing if it's okay to delete that content or you have to archive that content. That is I think probably one of the more important pieces of a mature governance solution is that you are then giving people the ability to say, I don't need this anymore. The data is free to be deleted or not. Here's what to do with that data. And as Copilot becomes more common, as people get more access to it, and we're not talking about price, I get it, but as it becomes more common, the cleanliness of your data, the validation of your data becomes more and more important. Because, for example, to if you're using Copilot to create content, Copilot, right? Build me a document that has subject X. All that old data that I have access to might be brought in as part of the source data. And so by not having a process to dispose of those teams and sites and groups and SharePoints, et cetera, that means I'm going to be bringing in irrelevant data to the content I'm creating, which lowers the value I'm getting out of that investment.
So, how do we tie all these concepts, again, as Jay said at the beginning, high level concepts together? Well, fortunately for you, we have a diagram. So, on the next slide,
Sorry.
here it comes. There it is. There it is. Okay. Working with the business users, and helping them identify the distinct areas of work that they're going to be creating and labeling those, and having a knowledge management, information management, governance plans that can meet the needs of those separate types of workspaces. One of the things I call out on this is not so much organizing this information by departments. Remember those age-old silo battles that we've had in the past? Hopefully, that's not such a thing in your organization. But notice here, we've got it called out for what are our team spaces? What are our project spaces? What are our communities? And what are the tools? The tools, Jay.
My mouse. Tools.
Tools that we're going to be using for each of those types of workspaces, and creating those governance plans for those types of workspaces.
So this is an exercise that I've performed with customers before. Is I know their end goal is to have governance in place. Well, okay, to have governance in place, we have to understand what do we want to govern and when do we want to govern it. And so in this exercise, we typically walk them through this very high level architecture of, okay, you're going to have certain types of spaces, team spaces for your departments, project spaces for things that have a start date and a theoretical end date, communities where, for example, when I was at Booz Allen Hamilton, we had a community around SharePoint. And then, of course, there's personal spaces like OneDrive. So you have these different types of spaces. As an organization, you have to decide When I want people to use the system, I want them to use it these certain ways, and I can then begin to develop the templates that go with these spaces, and with those templates, the processes of securing and governing those spaces. And so, yeah, like Joy talked about, if you go through an exercise like this, creating these spaces, the definition of these spaces and defining what tools go with them and what rules go with them, you can start to put into place the scripting and templating and guidance for that governance plan. As an example, when we look at labels, I believe it's Microsoft Information Protection labels now, part of Purview. When we look at labels, there are two primary types. There are sensitivity labels and retention labels. Sensitivity labels, when we want to look at encryption, restricted access, watermark. Retention labels, when we want to look at how long we keep something, what do we do when it's time to get rid of it, records management and information management processes, and even archiving. The comment I will make as your organization, because most are at least looking at that, is you may need more information. For example, there is a limit to how many labels you can have in your tenant. And so you need to start looking at, okay, if my labels drive DLP, if they drive records management, what other information do I need to look at in order to properly set that? And if you're getting into the advanced things, you can do things like workflows from label to label, or automated tagging based on other metadata, so that you can ensure that your content has the right protections. If you design a system like that, then when you design how to implement those labels, we can look at, as Joy said, the document management system behind Teams. So behind every team is a SharePoint site collection, correct? And behind the files for those teams in the default document library, we end up with a structure that very much mirrors, at least at some point in time, but that's a different conversation, the structure of our channels. And so when we look at that SharePoint library, we have options for managing the automatic application of both um, the tags and columns for our content, and the labels that go along with it. And so by knowing that this is all behind our SharePoint site collection, when somebody uploads a file into a discussion thread inside of Teams, we know that that file is automatically placed in the corresponding library, and we can automatically apply the right label or the right tag to that information. This is not a foolproof plan. But if you know how your organization works, you can begin to address application of things like this, to make sure that you're starting to address that information management requirement. All right. Now we're kind of low on time, and not in a bad way, right? We had these stories to actually fill time, and the good news is we haven't really needed it. So there's some examples at a high level. I've already talked about the creation of, or Joe and I talked about the creation of those types of teams. So the first example is, why would I need management around the creation of teams? So the story here is that we had a retail customer, global retail customer, and they didn't have a control process. And somebody in the Singapore office created an HR, human resources team for Singapore. And it was great until a few months later, when they realized that there was European persons data in that site, because it was just called human resources. And for those of you who aren't aware, the general data protection laws of Europe, the GDPR, that they say you have to have control over where that information is stored. It has to be stored in European servers, data centers. And so no governance here led to a data spill of sensitive information into regional boundaries it's not supposed to be. And so because they didn't have that plan in place, they had no way to manage and control that from happening.
The other one, broken functionality, not understanding how the permissions of channels work inside of a team. Um, Recently worked with a customer that had a situation where their team wasn't working and they called in a panic because the team wasn't working. They had created a department team and every channel was for the business areas of that department and every channel was private. No one could use the OneNote. No one could use the planner plan because they had pulled the permissions apart in that team so much. Everything was siloed into separate SharePoint sites.
Hmm.
And the group was so torn apart, no one could use the components that was intended for the whole team. So just not really thinking through the application of architecture and permissions, how they can work together or be very much disjointed.
So from a solutions perspective, for that first case study, there you really should have a process for understanding the business use of a site or a team,
Mm.
and then having the ongoing governance with them to make sure that it still matches what they've originally said. So having, whether it's a third-party tool, whether it's a Power Platform solution that you've created yourself, maybe based on the Center of Excellence, you really should have something to capture that relevant business information so that you can enforce policies around it. When it comes to Joy's conversation, the very first thing you should do is educate your users on how the system works. Telling them private channels are great. Here are reasons to use them, and here are reasons not to. Um, Guiding them to knowing that if I want something that's permission based, maybe I should consider a private or shared channel, but maybe I should consider a completely net new team. And so giving them that guidance as part of your governance is a huge part of making sure you're successful. Um, so we threw a lot at you, and it was very, like I mentioned at the beginning, very high level. We love having this conversation. And in fact, we dive deeper into this at various workshops and sessions. At, for example, the TechCon 365 series that is coming up in Seattle soon, hopefully in DC soon. As well as other virtual conferences. So please feel free to reach out to us and ping us with your questions. We'd love to share with you more. Misty, I hope since you're both in Oklahoma, you get a chance to get together in person. If you're ever in DC, let me know. I'd be happy to give you a tour of the MTC here, the Microsoft Technology Center, and show you some of the cool toys we have. But hopefully you found the content helpful. Yeah, that's all I got, Joy. What would you like to finish with?
Again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate the time. As Jay said, I'll echo it. Reach out to us if you want to have deeper conversations about this. There's lots of opportunities both through social media and the upcoming events in the community. Misty, I'm gonna go find you on LinkedIn. This has been amazing. Lisa, it was good to see you again. I saw you in the chat as well. Thank you very, very much.